The Chauchat weighed 20 pounds and fired the 8mm level cartridge. It emptied a 20-round magazine at 240 rounds per minute. Yet it was not built to be a good gun. It was built to be a cheap one, made by the 100,000. French squads needed to fire while they walked forward. Assistant gunners hauled its half-moon magazines through the mud. Ammunition bearers carried the spare loads. Gunners braced its whole recoiling body against the shoulder. A bicycle and automobile firm named Gladiator took the contract. Its factory turned out more than 262,000 of them. No automatic weapon of the war was made in greater numbers. Then the Americans arrived, with no automatic rifle of their own. They took the French gun and rechambered it for .30-06. Roughly 16,000 reached the doughboys. About 40% were rejected at the factory gate. The ones that passed could fire a few rounds, heat, and freeze. It was neither a machine gun nor a rifle. A machine gun of that war sat on a tripod, weighed as much as a man, and stayed where it was set. A rifle was carried by one soldier and fired one shot at a time. The Chauchat occupied the space between them. It was an automatic weapon meant to walk with the infantry, to be produced without an arsenal, and to be lost and replaced without regret. It was designed to be adequate, not admired. For most of its life in French hands, adequate was what it was, and adequate was a great deal more than the men in the trenches had before it arrived. The trouble is that history rarely leaves a weapon in the role it was designed for. A gun built to be cheap enough to lose became the standard automatic weapon of two armies. A gun proven in one cartridge was rebuilt in another it had never been designed around. A gun that mostly worked for the men who made it became, for the men who borrowed it, a symbol of everything that can go wrong when a weapon is rushed into a soldier's hands. Every strength it had was paid for somewhere else, in weight, in heat, in precision, or in the reputation it would carry for the next 100 years. That is the question this weapon forces. How do you put an automatic weapon into the hands of an entire army in a hurry, and what happens when the corners you cut to build it fast are the exact corners that fail under fire? The Chauchat is the longest answer anyone ever wrote to that question. It is an answer measured in stampings, in mud, in thermal expansion, and in thousandths of an inch of a chamber cut wrong. It is an answer that looks like failure from one direction and like foresight from another, and the truth is that it is both at once. Its story would travel from a Paris bicycle works to the trenches of the Somme, through the Half-Moon magazine and the walking advance, into American factories and the wrong caliber, onto the field at the Meuse-Argonne, and outward to 8 foreign armies and a reputation it has never escaped. To follow it honestly is to watch a good idea and a bad execution ride to war on the same 20 pounds of stamped steel. Chapter 1. The weapon France needed before it knew how to build one. France had machine guns that could not move. The Hotchkiss and the Saint-Étienne were heavy, tripod-mounted weapons that fired from fixed positions and stayed there. That arrangement suited defense. It did nothing for the attack. A gun of that class took a crew to carry, a tripod to mount, and a chosen position to fire from, and once it was set, it was rooted to that spot. When French infantry rose out of a trench and started across open ground, they left their automatic firepower behind them, bolted to the earth they had just left. The men who advanced alone. The gap was simple to describe and hard to fill. An advancing squad needed to carry fire forward with it. It needed a weapon light enough for one man to hold, and automatic enough to keep an enemy's heads down while the line closed the distance. No such weapon existed in quantity in any army in the world. Every major power had heavy machine guns, and every major power was learning in 1914 and 1915 what those guns did to men who crossed open ground in front of them. What no power yet had was a way to answer that fire while moving. The idea had a name in French doctrine. It was called feu en marchant, walking fire. And it imagined soldiers firing automatic weapons from the hip as they advanced, suppressing the enemy trench in the seconds it took to reach it. Colonel Louis Chauchat was among the officers who pressed that idea on French command in the years before the war. He was an artillery officer, a man trained to think about fire as something delivered in volume and on the move, and he understood that the concept was worthless without a gun to carry it. That gun had to be portable. It had to be served by one man, or by a small team built around one man. It had to fire the standard French cartridge, the 8mm level, because an army at war does not invent a new round to suit a new gun, and the whole logistical machine of France already ran on that cartridge. And it had to weigh in the neighborhood of 20 pounds, because a heavier weapon was no longer a thing a soldier could fire on his feet. Every pound above that number was a pound that pinned the gun to the ground the heavy machine guns already owned. Every one of those requirements was reasonable. Together they were a trap. Lightness fought against strength. A 20-pound automatic weapon firing a full-power rifle cartridge had almost no margin for a heavy, durable mechanism, no spare metal to absorb the shock and heat of automatic fire. Cheapness, which the coming war would demand in quantities no one had yet imagined, fought against precision. And portability fought against endurance, because a gun light enough to carry all day was a gun too light to fire all day. The requirement that made the Chauchat necessary was the same requirement that made it fragile. It was born compromised, and the compromise was not an accident, but the price of admission. Stand for a moment with the man this was meant to serve. He was a French infantryman, expected to advance across a field swept by machine gun fire, with a bolt-action rifle that fired one shot at a time and no way to suppress the trench in front of him as he moved. Every step across that field, he was a target that could not shoot back with any volume. Doctrine asked him to walk into that fire. The Chauchat was the promise that he would not walk into it empty-handed, that he or the man beside him could hose the enemy parapet with automatic fire and buy the squad the seconds it needed to cross. That promise was worth a great deal, and it explains why an army would accept a flawed gun rather than no gun. It is easy, a century later, to treat the Chauchat as a botched afterthought, a bad idea from the start. The evidence does not support that. The requirement behind it was correct, and it was ahead of its time. Every major army would eventually build a weapon to fill exactly this gap. The squad automatic weapon, the light machine gun carried in the assault, became one of the defining tools of 20th century infantry combat, and it remains so. France was reaching for it first, before the metallurgy and the manufacturing were ready to deliver it cleanly. That the reach exceeded the grasp is a different matter from reaching for the wrong thing. The reach itself was right. The trade-off was set before a single part was cut, and it is worth naming plainly because it governs everything that follows. Portability demanded lightness, and lightness demanded a thin, cheap, stamped structure that a real machine gun would never have accepted. The advantage was mobility, the ability to bring automatic fire into the attack. The cost was durability, the capacity to take heat and grit and hard use without failing. And the men who would pay that cost were not the officers who wrote the requirement, but the gunners who carried the result. The French army wanted a gun that could go forward with the attack. To get it, they would have to accept a gun that could not take the punishment a heavier weapon could shrug off. The doctrine existed. The requirement was written. The cartridge was fixed, and the weight was fixed, and the tactical need was urgent. What remained was the hardest part, and the part where the story turns from an idea into an object. Someone had to turn walking fire into steel, on a deadline measured against a war that had already begun, and was already killing Frenchmen faster than France could replace them. Chapter 2. 4 names on one gun. The Chauchat was not the work of a lone inventor bent over a bench. It was the product of a committee, a factory, and a clock that would not stop. Its very name records that fact, because 4 names are stamped into it, not one. Most famous guns carry a single name, the mark of one designer's vision. This one carries 4, and that is the first honest thing it tells you about itself. The gun was adopted as the Fusil Mitrailleur, model 1915 CSRG. Those 4 letters stand for 4 contributors. Chauchat is Colonel Louis Chauchat, who carried the concept and the tactical argument. Sutter is Charles Sutter, the senior armorer who did much of the practical mechanical work, the man who turned an officer's idea into a working action. Ribeyrolles is Paul Ribeyrolles, the manager of the company that would build it, the industrialist who made mass production possible. Gladiator is that company itself, a name that belonged not to a gunmaker, but to a maker of bicycles and cars. That naming is the truest thing about the weapon. It was designed by more than one hand, built by an industrial firm, and shaped as much by the men who would manufacture it as by the men who conceived it. The design did not appear in 1915, fully formed, in answer to the war. It had a long and patient prehistory. Work on an automatic rifle of this kind began at the Atelier de Construction de Puteaux, the French State Design Bureau, in the years between 1903 and 1910. This was peacetime work, unhurried and experimental, the slow business of trying an idea and setting it aside and trying it again. 8 trial prototypes were built and tested between 1903 and 1909, a decade of quiet iteration before any of it mattered to a war. A small series of about 100 guns was ordered in 1912, still years before the design became famous or infamous. Prototypes bearing the Chauchat and Sutter names were manufactured at the Manufacture d'Armes de Saint-Étienne in 1913 and 1914. Only when the war was underway, in 1915, did the design harden into the weapon the army would adopt and issue by the 100,000. That long gestation matters, because it corrects 2 old stories. The first is the story of the single genius, the lone Frenchman who dreamed up a terrible gun in a hurry. There was no such man and no such hurry at the start. There was a colonel with a concept, an armorer with a mechanism, a manager with a factory, and years of state trials behind them all. The gun was slow to be born and only fast to be multiplied. The second story is a matter of mechanical ancestry, and it is one of the most persistent myths about the weapon. Popular retellings once claimed the Chauchat's action was lifted from a 1910 design by the Hungarian engineer Rudolf Frommer. The record points elsewhere. The long recoil system at the heart of the gun traces to the work of the American designer John Browning, embodied in the Remington Model 8 self-loading rifle of 1906 and in the Browning Auto 5 shotgun of the same era. That claim of a Fromer origin requires restraint. It felt plausible because Fromer's pistols also used long recoil, an unusual system that invites the assumption of a single source. But the closer relative sits in an American sporting rifle and shotgun, not a Hungarian pistol. Picture the men who froze this design. They were not working in peacetime any longer, with years to refine and reject. By 1915, they were engineers under the pressure of a war that was consuming French manpower at a rate no one had planned for, and that demanded automatic weapons faster than any careful process could supply them. When they chose to standardize the model 1915, they were not declaring it perfect. They were declaring it good enough to build now, in quantity, because the alternative was to send infantry forward with nothing but bolt-action rifles against machine guns. That is a decision made under duress, and it should be judged as one. A perfect gun in 1917 was worth less than an adequate gun in 1915. That decision carried its own price, and the price was structural. Adopting a proven enough design quickly meant adopting its weaknesses quickly and locking them in. The long recoil action, the light construction, the magazine shape forced by the cartridge, all of it was frozen at once. There was no long tail of refinement ahead, no arsenal slowly perfecting each part across peacetime years, no chance to catch and fix the flaws before hundreds of thousands of the guns existed. The gun that reached the front in 1916 was very close to the gun that left the drawing board, and every fault in that drawing was about to be reproduced 250,000 times. There is a second-order consequence hidden in that speed, and it would matter more than the designers could have known. A design, frozen and mass-produced in wartime, cannot easily be changed once the tooling is set and the factories are running. When better magazines were designed later in the war, the machinery and the doctrine had already hardened around the old ones. The very decisiveness that got the gun into the field fast was the decisiveness that kept its worst features in the field long after they were understood. Speed bought the army its weapon, and then charged it interest for years. 4 names, then, and a deadline. The Chauchat's identity was set by who built it as much as by who designed it, by an industrialist and an armorer as much as by a colonel with a theory. But the choice that would define the weapon's whole life was not really a question of names or of mechanisms. It was a question of philosophy. It was the decision about how this gun would be made, and to what standard, and at what cost, that shaped everything that followed. To understand the Chauchat's failures, you have to understand what it was built to be, which was never the best gun, only the most gun that France could afford in the time it had. Chapter 3. Built to a price, not a standard. Most military weapons are built to a specification. A drawing sets a tolerance, and the part is made to meet it or it is rejected. The standard is the master, and cost and speed bend to serve it. The Chauchat inverted that order. It was built to a budget and a clock, and the specification came second. The question was never, how good can this part be? The question was, how cheaply and quickly can this part be made well enough to work? That was a deliberate choice, and for its moment it was a defensible one. Military small arms of the era were largely made the old way, from carefully machined and hand-fitted steel, in state arsenals that valued quality over speed and produced their guns slowly and expensively. That method made fine weapons, and made too few of them for the appetite of an industrial war. The Chauchat broke with it. It made heavy use of metal stampings, formed and pressed from sheet steel rather than milled from solid stock, at a time when stamped parts were unusual in a serious military firearm and were regarded by traditional gunmakers as cheap and second-rate. The whole philosophy prized mass production and low cost over the finish and precision of any individual component. The point was not to make a fine gun. The point was to make an ocean of adequate ones, and to make them faster than the enemy could kill the men who would carry them. The cartridge shaped the design as much as the philosophy did, and the cartridge was old. The standard French round, the 8mm level, dated to the 1880s, when France stunned the world by adopting the first smokeless powder military cartridge. It was a rimmed cartridge with a wide base and a pronounced taper, a shape built for the black powder era and carried forward by inertia into the age of the machine gun. A rimmed, tapered cartridge is a curse to feed automatically. It does not stack neatly in a straight-box magazine because each rim wants to catch on the rim beneath it, and the taper means the column of cartridges naturally curves. To feed it at all reliably, the magazine had to curve, and curve hard. That is the origin of the Chauchat's most recognizable feature, the deep half-moon magazine that swept down and forward beneath the gun like a crescent. It was not a stylistic choice. It was the geometry the cartridge demanded, and it would become the single most troublesome part of the entire weapon. The gun was shackled to a cartridge designed for a different age, and the shackle showed. The performance numbers were tuned to the same logic of restraint. The cyclic rate was set low, around 240 rounds per minute, far slower than the heavy machine guns of the day that fired at 2 and 3 times that pace. A low rate of fire was easier for one man to control on his feet, and it conserved ammunition that a walking soldier could carry only so much of, because a man advancing on foot had no belt-fed reserve behind him. The gun was not trying to hose down a field. It was trying to let one man suppress a position while his squad advanced, and then keep doing it with the next magazine, and the next, from whatever his team could carry. Restraint was designed into its very rhythm. Consider the factory planner given this brief. He was not told to make the best automatic rifle in the world. He was told to make thousands of them, then tens of thousands, faster than any arsenal had ever made anything, at a cost the French treasury could bear across a war of unknown length. Every decision flowed downhill from that order. Stampings instead of milled steel, simple parts instead of refined ones, riveted and pinned assemblies instead of carefully fitted ones, quantity as the first virtue and precision as a hope rather than a guarantee. A part that was good enough passed, because a part that was perfect was too slow. It is tempting to say that this cheapness is what doomed the gun, and to leave it there. That is too easy, and it is not quite true. The cheapness was the point, and at first it was the strength. It was what allowed France to arm its squads at all, to put automatic firepower into the hands of ordinary infantry across an entire army in the space of a couple of years. The failures that made the Chauchat infamous did not come from the idea of building cheaply. They came from specific weak components, and from specific lapses in control that the cheap philosophy allowed but did not require. A cheap gun is not automatically a broken one. The Sten, the Pew, and other crude mass-produced weapons that came later proved that stamped and simple could still mean reliable. This cheap gun had particular parts that broke, chief among them a magazine, and it is the parts that deserve the blame, not the philosophy alone. France was not alone in reaching for a light automatic, and the comparison is instructive. Britain fielded the Lewis gun, heavier at around 28 pounds and fed from a drum, a more robust weapon but a harder one to carry forward and a slower one to build. Denmark had the Madsen, an elegant and expensive design that no one could produce in the numbers a mass war demanded. The United States was developing the Browning automatic rifle, better than any of them, and would not have it ready in quantity until the very end of the war. Each nation was solving the same problem, and each was making a different bargain between weight, cost, reliability, and speed of production. France's bargain was the most extreme in one direction. It chose the lightest and the cheapest and the fastest to build, and it accepted the reliability penalty that choice carried. The Chauchat was not an aberration in a world of good guns. It was one answer, the most aggressive answer, to a question every army was struggling to answer at once. There is a second-order cost buried in the manufacturing method, and it would haunt the gun in the field. When parts are stamped and fitted loosely in the interest of speed, they are not perfectly interchangeable from gun to gun. An armorer who wanted to repair a Chauchat could not always take a part from one and drop it into another and expect it to fit. That is a small thing in a workshop and a large thing in a war, because it meant a damaged gun could not always be quickly cannibalized to keep another running. The cheapness that filled the trenches with guns also made each individual gun harder to keep alive once the trench had begun to wear it down. Here, the trade-off shows its full shape. Building cheap and fast put an automatic weapon into every French squad, which no other method could have done in the time available. That was the advantage, and it was enormous. Building cheap and fast also put the same weakness into every French squad, stamped and repeated tens of thousands of times over, so that a single design flaw became an army-wide flaw. The advantage arrived in quantity. So did the flaw. They came off the same line, in the same crates, at the same time. To see where that flaw lived, and why heat and mud found it so easily, you first have to watch the gun work. You have to follow a single cartridge through the strange, violent cycle of a long recoil action, from the pull of the trigger to the ejection of the empty case. Because it is in that cycle that the Chauchat's whole character, its cleverness and its curse, is written. Chapter 4. One full cycle of a long recoil gun. Most automatic weapons move a small part to do their work. A bolt slides back a few inches, or a gas piston shoves it, and the barrel never moves at all, staying fixed and aimed while a light component cycles behind it. The Chauchat was not most weapons. It moved almost everything it had, on every single shot, and the whole gun shuddered with the effort. To fire, it was to feel the entire mechanism throw itself backward and forward against your body, once for each round. The Chauchat used a system called long recoil, and the name describes exactly what happens. In that system, the barrel and the bolt are locked together at the moment of firing, and they recoil together for the entire length of a cartridge, all the way to the rear of the gun, before anything separates. Follow one round through it, slowly. The gunner presses the trigger. The firing pin strikes the primer, and the 8mm level cartridge fires, driving its bullet down the barrel. Roughly 470 millimeters of rifling, at a muzzle velocity in the neighborhood of 630 meters per second. At that instant, the barrel and the bolt are locked together as one rigid unit, sealed against the enormous pressure of the burning powder, and the recoil of the shot drives that whole locked assembly backward inside the gun's outer jacket or sleeve. That rearward travel is the defining act of the design, and it is what makes the gun so different from its contemporaries. The barrel does not stay put. It slides back the full length of a cartridge, carrying the bolt with it, still locked to the breech, compressing the recoil springs as it goes, and storing the energy of the shot. This is a great deal of steel in motion, and it travels a long way. Only when the assembly reaches the very rear of its travel does the sequence break apart. There, the bolt is caught and held by the mechanism, while the barrel is unlocked and released to run forward again on its own spring, leaving the bolt behind for a moment. Now the work of extraction and loading happens, and it happens in what feels like reverse order compared with a normal gun. As the barrel travels forward and away from the held bolt, the spent cartridge case, still gripped by the extractor on the bolt face, is drawn straight backward out of the chamber, because the chamber is moving forward while the case is held still. The case clears the barrel entirely, strikes the ejector, and is thrown clear of the gun. The barrel continues forward and settles into battery, empty and open and ready. Only then is the bolt released. It runs forward under its own spring, strips the next cartridge from the lips of the magazine, drives it up and into the waiting chamber, and locks home against the breech once more. If the trigger is still held, the gun fires again, and the entire violent journey repeats, barrel and bolt to the rear together, barrel forward alone, bolt forward alone, 20 times over for a full magazine. That is a great deal of mass in motion, and the gunner felt every ounce of it. The reciprocating parts of a long recoil gun are not a light little bolt weighing a few ounces. They are the barrel and the breech, and their housing together. A heavy assembly, slamming to the rear and then forward again, traveling more than twice the length of a cartridge on every cycle. All of that mass reverses direction twice per shot, and each reversal is a blow transmitted through the gun into the man holding it. The French had a word for the gun's habit of punishing the man who fired it. They called the recoil la gifle, the slap, and it earned the name honestly against shoulders and cheeks, a heavy shove and a rattle that made accurate sustained fire genuinely difficult. It would be a mistake to call this system mechanically primitive, a common charge against the gun. Long recoil is a legitimate operating system with a real pedigree, used in shotguns and rifles that worked perfectly well for decades, including some of the most respected sporting arms ever made. Its logic is sound. By letting the barrel and bolt stay locked together through the high-pressure moment, and only separating them once everything has traveled to the rear and slowed, it can handle a full-power cartridge in a relatively simple, forgiving action without an intricate gas system to foul and fail. That claim of primitiveness needs context. The system was not crude in conception. It was demanding in practice, especially in a gun built as light and as cheap as this one. The rhythm of the gun came from its springs, and the springs tell you why the fire rate was so low. The recoil of the shot loaded them, storing the energy of firing, and their controlled release timed the barrel's return and the bolt's release, metering out the whole long cycle. A short recoil or gas gun completes its cycle in a fraction of the distance, so it can fire fast. The Chauchat's parts had to travel the full length of a cartridge to the rear, and then most of the way forward again before the next round could even begin to chamber, and no spring can move that much steel that far quickly without shaking a light gun to pieces. The low cyclic rate of roughly 240 rounds per minute was therefore not only a tactical choice for controllability, as it is often described, it was also a physical consequence of the mechanism, the natural pace of a gun that moved its whole heart back and forth on every shot. The gun fired slowly because it could not, given its design, fire any faster without tearing itself apart. What long recoil could not escape was heat and violence, and in a light gun those two enemies had nowhere to hide. All that moving mass generated friction and shock with every cycle, grinding metal against metal. The full-power cartridge generated heat, a great deal of it, poured into the chamber and barrel, shot after shot. In a heavy machine gun, sheer mass and often a water jacket could absorb both the heat and the shock, soaking them up in pounds of steel and gallons of water. In a 20-pound automatic rifle built from stampings, there was very little metal to soak up the punishment, and nothing at all to cool it. The long recoil design made a light, full-power automatic weapon possible at all, which was its genuine achievement. It also concentrated heat and force into a structure that could barely contain them, which was its genuine flaw. The two were inseparable. Two faces of the same clever, overburdened mechanism. The heat had a specific and dangerous consequence, and it followed directly from the long recoil layout. The barrel had to slide freely back and forth inside its sleeve for the gun to function at all. But metal expands when it heats, and a barrel that had fired many rounds in quick succession swelled inside its housing. As the fit grew tighter, the sliding grew harder, and past a certain point, the thermal expansion could bind the reciprocating parts and lock the assembly in the rear position, freezing the gun until it cooled and shrank. A weapon whose whole principle depended on a long, free slide was undone by the very heat that firing produced. The gun's operating system contained the seed of its own stoppage. The advantage of the system was real, and it should be stated as plainly as the flaw. Long recoil let France build the light, one-man automatic it wanted, firing the full power service cartridge without a complex and failure-prone gas mechanism. The cost of the system was just as real. It filled the gun with heat and hammering that a light frame could not shrug off. It drove the gunner's face back with every burst, and it built a stoppage into the mechanism whenever the gun grew hot. Those were the terms of the bargain, written into the mechanism itself, unavoidable once the choice of a light, long recoil weapon was made. And heat, once generated, does not stay politely in the barrel. It spreads through the whole assembly, and it swells the metal, and it goes looking for the weakest point in the machine to exploit. In the Chauchat, that weakest point was not hard to find. It was riding on the bottom of the gun, stamped from thin sheet metal, cut open on both sides to the air and the mud, feeding cartridges up into all that heat and motion. To understand why the gun jammed, you have to leave the action and look at the magazine. Chapter 5. The Bicycle Factory That Went to War. The most produced automatic weapon of the First World War was not made in a national arsenal, staffed by generations of gunsmiths. It was made in a plant that had spent its peacetime years building bicycles, motorcycles, and motor cars for French civilians. That fact is not a curiosity at the edge of the story. It is close to the center of it, because who built the gun explains a great deal about how the gun turned out. The firm was Gladiator, the Société des Cycles Gladiator, based at Pré-Saint-Gervais on the northern edge of Paris. Before the war, it made vehicles for a comfortable civilian market, chains and frames and engines, the machinery of peacetime mobility. When the war came, it converted to arms manufacture under the management of Paul Ribeyrolles, the same Ribeyrolles whose name is stamped into the gun's designation. A firm that understood pressed steel, repetitive assembly, and volume production was, in one sense, exactly the right kind of firm for a weapon designed around stampings and mass output. In another sense, it was exactly the wrong kind, because it had none of the gun-making tradition that catches the small errors before they leave the door. A second contractor, a firm known as Sidarme, was brought in later to add capacity. Between them, from December 1915 to November 1918, they built on the order of 262,000 Chauchats. Around 244,000 of those were chambered in 8mm level for French service. Gladiator alone accounted for roughly 225,700 of the French caliber guns, plus the 19,000 built in American 30-06. Sidarme added about 18,600, entering production only in October 1917, late in the war. Those numbers are the reason the Chauchat matters, whatever else is said about it. It was the most produced automatic weapon of the entire war, and by a wide margin the most common light automatic in French service, the gun that actually armed the squads. A factory that had been pressing bicycle frames a few years earlier was now turning out machine rifles faster than any dedicated arsenal in the world. That was the triumph of the cheap, stamped, mass production philosophy, and it was a real triumph. It worked. The guns came off the line in a flood, and that flood put automatic fire into the hands of an entire army. The flood carried defects with it, and the two contractors did not produce equal work. This is one of the quieter but more important facts about the gun, because it shows the failures were not evenly spread. Sidarme's Chauchats, made later and with the benefit of experience, were generally better finished and better functioning than Gladiators. Gladiators' guns, made in far greater numbers and reaching the field first and most, carried recognizable faults that the firm never fully mastered. Many of them had their sights fitted out of alignment, so that the gun shot systematically low and to the right of where it was aimed. That failing was recognized during the war and documented. It was never corrected. A soldier issued one of those guns had to discover its error for himself and learn to aim off, to hold high and to the left, to compensate for a factory that would not fix its own tooling. The gun did not simply need to be mastered. It needed to be second-guessed. Stand on that factory floor for a moment. The workers there were not arsenal craftsmen with decades at the bench and a tradition behind them. Many were wartime labor, including workers who had built bicycle and automobile parts a year or two earlier and now found themselves stamping, forming, and fitting the components of an automatic weapon to tolerances they had never before been asked to hold. Some parts came out well. Some did not. There was no long tradition of gun-making in that building to catch the difference before it left the door. No master's eye trained to reject the piece that was almost right. The gun was as good as the tooling and the inspection, and the tooling was fast and the inspection was hurried. This is where the label deserves a harder look, and where restraint is owed. The Chauchat is often called simply the worst gun ever built, as though that verdict were settled. Whatever its faults, and they were many, it was also the most produced automatic weapon of its war, made in numbers that dwarfed the finely crafted guns that are remembered fondly today. That reframes the story. A weapon that failed as completely and universally as the harshest legend claims does not get built 250,000 times, does not get issued as the standard automatic of a major army through 4 years of the hardest fighting in history, does not get adopted by a second great power in its hour of need. The sheer scale of its production is itself an argument that the truth is more complicated than the reputation, that a gun this widely made must have done something right often enough to justify making more. The trade-off of the bicycle factory was blunt, and it was total. A converted civilian plant could produce guns at a speed no traditional arsenal could match, and that speed armed the French infantry when nothing else could have. That was the whole point, and it was achieved. That same plant could not guarantee the precision that an automatic weapon, firing a full-power cartridge through a heat-swollen sliding action, genuinely needed to work reliably. France chose speed over precision with open eyes, because speed was what the war demanded. It got its guns, hundreds of thousands of them, and it got their faults in the same crates, stamped in at the same time. And there was a second-order cost that fell on the men closest to the guns, the unit armorers. Because the stamped parts were not perfectly interchangeable between guns, and because gladiator and sidearm production differed, keeping a company's Chauchats running was a constant, fiddling labor. The faults did not spread themselves evenly across the weapon, either. They gathered, above all others, in one detachable part, the part a soldier removed and replaced and dropped in the mud a dozen times in a single fight. To understand why the Chauchat jammed, you have to understand the magazine, because the magazine is where the whole cheap, hurried, stamped philosophy of the gun came to its point. Chapter 6. The Half Moon That Failed. By late 1916, the French army had enough combat experience with the Chauchat to ask a hard question about its own gun, and to answer it honestly. General Pétain, who understood that morale and material could not be separated, ordered a survey of the weapon's failures. The answer that came back did not point at the Germans, or the mud, or the weather, or the cold as the chief enemy of the gun. It pointed inward. It pointed at the magazine. That survey concluded that the open-sided, half-moon magazines were defective, and that they caused about 2/3 of all stoppages. Not a fraction. Not one cause among many. 2/3. The most common way for a Chauchat to fail, by a wide margin, was for its own magazine to fail to feed a cartridge into the action. Everything else the gun was blamed for, the overheating, the extraction troubles, the punishing recoil, sat beneath that single dominant fault. If you could fix the magazine, you would fix most of the gun's stoppages at a stroke. France knew this by the end of 1916, in the middle of the war, with the gun already in mass production and mass use, and could not act on the knowledge fast enough to matter. The magazine's problems began with its shape, and its shape was not its own fault. The rimmed, tapered 8mm level cartridge forced the deep half-moon curve, as we have seen, because that old cartridge could not be stacked any other way. But the execution made a bad shape worse. To keep the gun light and cheap, the magazine was made from thin sheet metal, easily dented, easily bent, easily knocked out of the precise geometry that feeding demands. A magazine is not a passive box. It is a machine that must present each cartridge to the bolt at exactly the right height and angle, and a thin steel shell that has been dropped and trodden and crushed in a pack cannot always do that. And then there were the sides. The sides were cut open, left with large gaps through which the rounds inside could be seen. Those open sides are the detail everyone remembers, and they were a genuine liability of the worst kind. In the trenches, mud and grit and sand did not have to work their way past a cover or a dust cap to reach the ammunition. They had an open door, an invitation. Dirt entered the magazine directly, coated the rounds, packed into the follower, and choked the feed. The soldiers adapted, as soldiers do, with a small and telling habit. A Chauchat magazine was designed to hold 20 rounds. Gunners often loaded it with only 18 or 19 instead. A fully loaded magazine put maximum pressure on the spring and the follower, and made a first-round failure to feed more likely, so the men who used the gun quietly gave up 1 or 2 rounds of capacity to buy a better chance that the first shot, the shot that most often mattered, would actually feed. That is the kind of adjustment soldiers make around a weapon they cannot trust and cannot replace. They learn its temper, they trade capability for reliability, and they manage the gun rather than rely on it. A weapon that must be underloaded to be trusted is a weapon that has already confessed something about itself. The magazine's fragility carried a second cost that fell on the men behind the gun, in labor rather than in capacity. Because dirt entered through the open sides so readily, the magazines had to be cleaned constantly, wiped and picked free of grit whenever there was a lull, or they would choke on the next burst. That work fell to the assistant gunner and the magazine carrier, and it never ended, because the trench was made of the very filth the magazine invited in. A crew did not simply carry loaded magazines into a fight. They carried magazines they had to keep clean under fire, in the rain, in the mud, with cold hands, and a magazine dropped in the wrong place at the wrong moment was very likely a magazine that would jam the gun on its first cartridge. The open design did not only cause stoppages, it created a permanent, grinding maintenance burden that consumed the attention of half the crew, and it did so precisely when that attention was most needed for fighting. The gun asked its team to serve the magazine as much as the magazine served the gun. The open sides were not, in fairness, a baffling mistake with no reasoning behind them, and honesty requires saying so. There was a purpose. Through the open gaps, the gunner could see at a glance how many rounds he had left. A real and useful thing in the middle of a firefight, when knowing whether to keep firing or to change magazines could decide the next few seconds of a man's life. That claim of pure carelessness requires restraint. The designers made a choice, with a genuine benefit on one side of the ledger, a live ammunition count. It simply happened to carry a catastrophic cost on the other side, in a war fought in more mud than any of them had imagined when they drew the magazine. The benefit was visible and immediate. The cost was hidden until the guns reached the trenches. The French did try to fix it, and the attempt is part of the tragedy. Several prototypes of enclosed, dirt-proof magazines, with the open sides sealed and the ammunition protected, were designed and successfully tested in May and June of 1918. They worked. They did what the original magazine could not, keeping the filth of the trench away from the cartridges. And they came too late. The war ended in November of that year, only a few months later, and the improved magazines never reached the field in numbers that could change the gun's record or rescue its reputation. The fix existed. It had been proven. The clock simply ran out before it could be issued, and the gun went into history judged by the flawed magazine rather than the corrected one. Weigh the trade the magazine represented, because it is the whole gun in miniature. Its open sides gave the gunner a live count of his rounds, a real advantage in the moment of a firefight. Those same open sides gave the war a direct path into the heart of the mechanism, and paid for the count with 2/3 of the gun's stoppages, with jams at the worst possible moments, with a weapon that failed when its owner needed it most. The advantage was printed on the outside of the magazine, where anyone could see it. The cost was buried in the feed, where it could only be discovered under fire. Every advantage the Chauchat offered was paid for somewhere the buyer could not see at the time of purchase. Here is the part of the story that makes what comes next so hard to forgive. Even with the flawed magazine, even with the heat and the recoil and the jams, in French hands and firing French ammunition made to French chambers, the Chauchat mostly worked. It was not a good gun. It was, most days and in short bursts, a functioning one. It suppressed enemy positions and let squads advance, and did the job it had been imagined for, imperfectly but really. So, when the same basic weapon crossed into American service and became not merely flawed but a genuine disaster, the fault did not lie only in the old, known problems that the French had learned to manage. Something new was about to be done to this gun, in a foreign country's factory, for a foreign country's cartridge, in a greater hurry than even 1915 had known. Chapter 7. Combat effective, and hated anyway. The French Chauchat was not a good gun. It was, on most days and within its limits, a working one. Both of those statements are true at the same time, and the whole honesty of the weapon's history depends on holding them together. To say only the first is to slander a gun that carried an army. To say only the second is to excuse a weapon that punished the men who trusted it too far. The truth lives in the tension between them. Its limits were real, and the men who carried it learned them by heart, because their lives depended on the lesson. Chief among the limits was heat. Fired in long, sustained bursts, the way a frightened or hard-pressed gunner would want to fire in a crisis, the gun's action would overheat, and the thermal expansion of the barrel inside its sleeve could bind the reciprocating parts and lock the whole assembly in the rear position, freezing the gun solid until it cooled. Sources disagree on exactly where that limit fell, and the disagreement is worth stating plainly rather than papering over. Some accounts place the danger point at around 120 rounds of continuous 8mm fire before the gun seized. Others put it nearer 300 rounds for a clean, well-maintained weapon. That range is not a contradiction to be resolved by picking a number. It reflects a real truth, that the limit depended on the individual gun, on how clean it was, on how well it was oiled, and on how the bursts were spaced. What is not in dispute is the instruction that followed from it. The manuals told gunners to fire in short bursts only, and to let the gun rest between them. A soldier who ignored that advice in the heat of a fight, who held the trigger down when the enemy was close, could find his weapon locked and useless at the exact moment he needed it alive. The recoil was the other constant companion, and it never let up. The long recoil action drove its heavy reciprocating mass back against the shooter with every single round, a shove and a rattle rather than a rifle's clean push, and it struck him in the face when he held it wrong or fired it from an awkward position. La gifle, the slap, was not a nickname invented later by critics looking for a story. It was the daily physical experience of firing the gun, felt in the cheekbone and the shoulder. The effective range was modest, on the order of 200 meters, and the misaligned gladiator sights on many guns made even that modest range harder to use well than it should have been, so that a gunner had to fight both the enemy and his own weapon's habits to put rounds where he wanted them. The men who served it were organized, over time, around its needs, and the way the crew grew tells you how much the gun demanded. It began as a two-man weapon, a gunner and an assistant, one to fire and one to feed. But feeding and serving the weapon in real combat, keeping it supplied with loaded magazines and keeping those magazines clean, took more hands than two. By October 1917, the team had grown into a four-man squad built around the gun, a squad leader, the gunner, an assistant gunner, and a dedicated magazine carrier. 4 men to serve one automatic rifle, because the rifle could not serve itself. Each gunner also carried a small pistol for personal defense, a .32 caliber Ruby, an inexpensive Spanish-made automatic, with 3 magazines of 9 rounds apiece, because a man wrestling a 20-pound automatic across a battlefield could not also fight effectively with a bolt-action rifle slung on his back. The gun reshaped the squad around itself. That reshaping was itself a kind of proof, if anyone had cared to read it that way. An army does not build a 4-man team around a weapon it considers worthless. The French committed those men, that pistol, those dedicated magazine carriers, and all the training and organization behind them, because the automatic fire the gun provided was worth the cost of serving it, even at 4 men to a gun. The doctrine of walking fire, the whole reason the Chauchat existed, was being validated every day in the way the infantry organized itself around the weapon, whatever the gunners muttered about it. A gun that was simply useless would have been quietly abandoned in the field, left in the mud, its crews reverting to rifles. Instead, the army grew its squads to keep the guns fed and firing. The complaints were real, and so was the reliance. And the reliance is the louder testimony of the two. Stand with that gunner in the line. He trusted the Chauchat to work in short bursts, and within those bursts, most of the time, it did. He advanced with it across ground that a rifleman alone could not have crossed. He suppressed the enemy parapet with it, and he kept his squad moving because of it. He also knew, from hard experience, not to hold the trigger down, not to let the gun cook, not to expect it to behave like the heavy, water-cooled guns bolted into the rear positions. His relationship with the weapon was a negotiation conducted under fire. As long as he kept his side of the bargain, firing in disciplined bursts and cleaning the magazines when he could, the gun mostly kept its side. When he broke the bargain, the gun broke with him. This is where one of the most durable myths deserves direct correction, because it has swallowed the true story. The popular claim is that the Chauchat could not fire a single magazine without jamming, that it was useless the moment it was picked up, a weapon that failed on the first pull of the trigger. The record of French service does not support that, and the men who fought 4 years with it would not have recognized it. The 8mm gun was combat effective within its limits, which is a real category and not a euphemism. It stopped, and it frustrated, and it overheated, and it slapped its gunners in the face. But it also did its job across the largest war the world had yet seen, in the hands of the very army that had built it and knew it best. The myth of total, immediate uselessness felt true later, and it felt true for a specific reason that had nothing to do with this French gun. It felt true because of a different version of the weapon, in a different cartridge, in different hands. It was not true of this one. The trade-off in French service was the same one written into the gun at its birth, now paid daily in the field rather than argued on paper. The Chauchat was light enough to carry forward into the attack, which was the entire point and the entire achievement, the thing no heavy machine gun could do. It was also too light to fire for long without cooking itself, and too crude to fire without punishing the man behind it, and too open to keep the mud out of its own magazine. Portability bought France its walking fire, its automatic weapon in the assault. Portability also bought France a gun that had to be nursed, coaxed, underloaded, and forgiven through every fight. The army got exactly what it had asked for, advantages and costs bound together and inseparable. That was the weapon as it stood in 1917, flawed but functioning, understood and managed by the army that made it, when a new and enormous army entered the war on France's side. The United States arrived with a doctrine for the automatic rifle, a rapidly growing supply of men, and almost nothing to put in their hands. It had the theory of squad automatic fire and none of the guns. What France could supply, America would have to take, and it would have to take it in a hurry, and it would have to make it speak American. Chapter 8. The Army That Had Nothing Else. The United States entered the war in April 1917 with a clear idea of what an automatic rifle was for, and almost no automatic rifles to issue. That gap, between a doctrine that existed on paper and a weapon that did not exist in the arsenals, is the whole reason an American soldier ever carried a Chauchat. It was not a choice made from admiration for the French gun. Nobody who had studied the Chauchat admired it. It was a choice made from empty arms racks and a closing calendar. America's own answer to the automatic rifle problem, the Browning automatic rifle, existed as a design but not yet as a flood of weapons. It was a superb design, one of the best of its kind, but a design on a drawing and a handful of prototypes is not a weapon in a squad. It would take time to tool up, to produce, and to ship it across the Atlantic in the numbers a mass army required, and time was the one thing the American Expeditionary Force did not have. It was arriving in France through 1917 and 1918, and going into the line as it arrived, and it needed automatic weapons for its squads immediately, in the same walking fire role the French had built the Chauchat to fill. France had the Chauchat, and France had it in quantity, coming off the Gladiator line by the tens of thousands. So the AEF adopted it, first in its original 8mm level form, as an emergency weapon to arm American squads until something better crossed the ocean. It was a stopgap, and everyone involved knew it was a stopgap. Then came the decision that would turn a mediocre gun into an infamous one. American infantry did not use the 8mm level cartridge. They used the .30-06 Springfield, a rimless, powerful, modern round that was the standard of the United States Army and the ammunition its whole supply chain already carried. Supplying American troops with a French cartridge gun meant running a second, foreign ammunition stream alongside their own, shipping 8mm level across the Atlantic and pushing it up to the front beside the .30-06, a logistical burden no quartermaster wanted in a war already straining every supply line. The obvious solution, the sensible-looking solution, was to rechamber the Chauchat for American .30-06 so that American squads could feed their automatic rifle from the same crates that fed their Springfields. A version was ordered built to that standard, designated the model 1918 in .30-06, fed by a 16-round box magazine rather than the 20-round half-moon of the French gun, because the shorter, rimless American cartridge did not need the same deep crescent curve. The numbers were substantial for a stopgap. Roughly 19,000 of the .30-06 Chauchats were ordered, and on the order of 16,000 were delivered to the AEF between August 1917 and November 1918. On paper, this was a sensible fix to a real problem. It would let American squads carry an automatic weapon that ate American ammunition, produced on an existing and running French line rather than waiting for American factories, delivered in months rather than the years a purely domestic program would have taken. On paper, feeding the gun from the same ammunition as the rifle, it solved the supply problem cleanly and quickly. On paper is where it worked. Picture the doughboy at the receiving end of that logic. He was often days or weeks off the boat, with limited training on any automatic weapon, handed a French-designed gun full of French quirks and French tolerances, rechambered for his own cartridge by a process he knew nothing about, sometimes with a manual written in a language he could not read. He had never seen anything like it at home, on the farm, or in the town he had left. He was told it was what he would carry into the largest and hardest battles the United States Army had yet fought, into the Aisne-Marne and Saint-Mihiel and the Meuse-Argonne. He took it because there was nothing else to take, because the alternative to a bad automatic rifle was no automatic rifle, and a squad without one crossed open ground the way the French had crossed it in 1914, naked to the enemy's machine guns. It is easy, looking back, to call the American adoption of the Chauchat a foolish blunder, a case of an army buying a gun everyone knew was bad. That judgment is unfair to the situation those men were in. The AEF did not choose the Chauchat over some better weapon it could have had in its hands that season. It chose the Chauchat over nothing, because the better weapon, its own Browning, was not yet available at the front in the numbers required. Given an army pouring into combat without automatic rifles, and a French ally with a factory already making them, taking France's gun was not stupidity. It was arithmetic. It was the only box on the table with guns in it. The depth of that dependence produced a decision that looks almost unbelievable in hindsight. There is a record that in mid-1918, as the Browning automatic rifle was finally beginning to reach the front, newly arrived American divisions were ordered to give up their Brownings and carry Chauchats instead, so that the precious new guns could be held back rather than risk being captured and copied by the enemy. Whether or not one accepts every detail of that account, the logic it reveals is real, and it measures how thin the American automatic rifle supply truly was. An army that would even consider handing back its best weapon for a worse one was an army with almost nothing to spare. The Chauchat was not carried because commanders failed to see its faults. It was carried because the alternative, for month after critical month, was a squad with no automatic weapon at all. And no general would send men across that ground unarmed if a flawed gun could be put in their hands instead. The trade-off was clear and, for a while, defensible. Adopting the French gun armed the AEF squads in months, which no American program could have matched, and put automatic fire into American hands in time for the battles that would decide the war. Adopting the French gun also meant importing France's existing problems, the heat and the recoil and the fragile open magazine, into American service and American ignorance, without the years of hard-won handling knowledge the French gunners had accumulated. That was a bargain the AEF could probably have lived with, more or less, the way the French had lived with it, managing a flawed but functional weapon. What turned a difficult bargain into a catastrophe was not the old French flaws that came with the design. It was the new work, the rechambering itself, done in haste and done badly. The cartridge that was supposed to simplify American supply turned out to be the thing that broke the gun. To see exactly how, you have to go down to the level where the failure actually lived, into the chamber of the barrel, and measure the mistake in thousandths of an inch. Chapter 9. The Wrong Chamber. The 8mm Chauchat was a mediocre gun that mostly worked. The American .30-06 Chauchat was something worse, a gun that often could not fire more than a handful of rounds before it froze solid. The difference between the two was not the design, which was the same in its essentials. It was a manufacturing error, and it was measured in thousandths of an inch, at the one place in a gun where thousandths of an inch decide everything. The failure lived in the chamber, the short, precisely shaped section at the rear of the barrel that holds and supports the cartridge at the instant of firing. A chamber must fit its cartridge within very tight limits. Too tight, and the round will not seat, or the fired case will not release. Too loose, and the case can rupture. In the .30-06 conversion, the chambers were reamed incorrectly. Their dimensions were wrong, along with other dimensional defects in the rechambered guns, the marks of a rushed conversion done to loose standards. The consequence was direct and crippling. When the gun fired and the chamber heated, even slightly, the fired cartridge case would swell against the walls of the miscut chamber and stick fast. The extractor, trying to draw that case backward out of the chamber during the barrel's forward travel, could not pull it free. The gun suffered a failure to extract. The spent case jammed in place, blocking the chamber, and the weapon stopped dead with a fired case locked in the breech. Clean or dirty, in a good gunner's hands or a poor one's, a gun with a wrong chamber could not reliably pull its own empty cases, and no amount of skill or care could fix a barrel that had been cut wrong at the factory. It is worth being clear about why heat made it so much worse, because it explains why the gun could pass a cold inspection and still fail in combat. When a cartridge fires, its brass case expands hard against the chamber walls to seal the gases, then springs back slightly as the pressure drops, and that small spring back is what lets the extractor pull it free. A correctly cut chamber leaves just enough room for that release. A chamber cut too tight, or cut to the wrong shape, leaves too little. And a warm chamber leaves less still, because the surrounding steel has expanded inward around the case. So a misreamed Chauchat might extract its first cold round or two, and then, as those first shots warmed the chamber, cross the line into failure and lock up. That is exactly the pattern the guns showed, and it is exactly the pattern that ruins a weapon in a fight, because a fight is precisely when the gun gets hot. A test fired slowly, a few cold rounds at a time, could hide the fault. A battle could not. That is a different kind of failure, and a worse one, than the French gun's usual troubles. The 8mm Chauchat stopped mostly because its magazine fed badly, and a bad feed is often something a soldier can clear, tapping the magazine, working the action, getting the gun back into the fight. The .30-06 Chauchat stopped because the fired brass would not leave the chamber, and a case welded into a hot, tight chamber by its own expansion is something a gunner in the field can do almost nothing about in the middle of a firefight. He would have to let the gun cool, force the case out, and hope the next one did not do the same. And the failure appeared fast. Not after a long burst, but after a few rounds, because it took only a little heat to bring the miscut chamber into the range where cases stuck. In combat, where a gun grows warm almost immediately, that meant the weapon could betray its owner within seconds of opening fire. The scale of the problem was visible before the guns ever left France, which is the most damning fact of all. American ordnance inspectors, stationed at the Gladiator factory to check the guns being built for their army, rejected on the order of 40% of the .30-06 production outright, refusing to accept nearly half of what the line produced. That figure needs to be stated precisely, because it is easy to misuse. It does not mean that 40% of all Chauchats everywhere failed in the field. It means that of the American caliber guns coming off that particular line, inspectors judged roughly 4 in 10 unacceptable at the factory gate, bad enough to turn away on the spot. The reasonable conclusion from that number is not comforting, and it should not be softened. If that many were bad enough to reject before they ever reached a soldier, the standard of the entire run was low, and the 60% that passed inspection were passing a low bar, and many of them still proved troublesome once they reached the front and the heat of combat found their chambers. The rejection rate is not reassurance that the bad ones were caught. It is a warning about the ones that got through. There is a fair charge to weigh here, and a myth to set aside with it. The unfair, dramatic version of the story says that the French deliberately fobbed off, sabotaged, or deliberately ruined guns on their American allies, a betrayal dressed as assistance. The evidence does not support malice, and it is worth saying so clearly. It points instead to a rushed, badly executed caliber conversion and a collapse of quality control, a program that changed the cartridge the gun was built around without holding the tolerances that such a change absolutely required. That distinction matters, morally and historically. This was a failure of manufacturing and haste and inspection, not a failure of loyalty or a deliberate wrong. It was no less damaging to the men who carried the guns for being honest rather than malicious, but honesty about the cause is owed to everyone involved, including the French factory whose speed had armed France's own army. Stand with the American gunner who was issued one of these. He loaded it, he raised it, he fired, and after a few rounds, as the barrel warmed under his hands, the gun, locked with a spent case, gripped in a chamber cut too tight to release it. He cleared it if he could, painfully, and fired again, and after a few more rounds, it happened again. In the middle of the Meuse-Argonne, the largest battle the American army had ever fought, with German machine guns ahead of him and his squad depending on his fire, that was not a weapon in any meaningful sense. It was a liability he had been ordered to carry across a battlefield. One American officer, Lieutenant Lemuel Shepard, later recalled the relief when the change finally came. The day after the armistice, with the guns silent, the order arrived at last to turn in their Chauchats and draw Browning automatic rifles instead. The gun they had been given for the war was replaced the morning after it ended. The trade-off of the American caliber was the cruelest turn in the whole story because it defeated its own purpose. Rechambering the Chauchat to .30-06 was meant to spare American supply the burden of a second cartridge, and that was a real and sensible goal. But rechambering it this badly, with chambers cut wrong, produced a gun that could not reliably extract that very cartridge, which destroyed the entire reason for having the gun at all. An automatic weapon that will not keep firing is not a lighter logistical burden. It is a dead weight and a false promise. The fix for a supply problem created a gun that would not fire, and so solved nothing and cost much. That failure, in that caliber, in front of those men, in the last and largest battles of the war, is where the legend was truly born. The phrase that would follow the Chauchat forever, the worst gun ever made, was not written in French mud in 1916 by the poilus who managed the 8mm gun for 4 years. It was written in American frustration in 1918, by doughboys betrayed by a botched conversion of a gun that was never theirs to begin with. And a legend, once written and once felt in the body of a frightened man on a battlefield, is far harder to correct than a chamber. Chapter 10. The worst gun ever, a claim that needs context. The Chauchat's reputation rests almost entirely on its worst version, in its worst cartridge, in its worst months, in the memory of the army that suffered its worst incarnation. The reputation is a single, satisfying sentence: the worst gun ever made. The record underneath that sentence is far more divided and far more interesting than the verdict it produced. A fair judge has to look under the sentence. Start with the thing modern testing has actually shown, because it is the most direct challenge to the legend. The firearms researcher Ian McCollum obtained a surviving American model 1918 Chauchat in .30-06, a genuine example of the very version that earned the gun its infamy, and put it through a live reliability test, the kind of test the reputation says it should fail inside a single magazine. It did not fail inside a single magazine. He fired well over 100 rounds through it, reaching around 110 rounds, before he saw an odd malfunction, and he stopped there mainly to avoid damaging a century-old weapon that could not be replaced. That result does not make the .30-06 Chauchat a good gun, and McCollum did not claim it did. A 100-year-old survivor firing well on modern, consistent ammunition is not the same as a rushed wartime gun firing badly on 1918 ammunition in the mud. But it does directly contradict the harshest version of the myth, the claim that the gun simply cannot get through one magazine without jamming. A surviving example, a full century later, plainly could, and that fact has to be admitted into the record. The key to the whole reputation is a distinction the legend erases, and it is the single most important thing to understand about the Chauchat. There were two very different guns wearing the same name. The 8mm Lebel Chauchat, in French service, was combat effective within its limits, the most produced automatic weapon of the war, a flawed but genuinely functioning tool that carried an army for 4 years. The .30-06 American Chauchat, with its misreamed chambers and its rushed conversion, was abysmal, a gun that often would not keep firing. And it was this version, in this cartridge, that shaped the English-speaking world's entire memory of the weapon. When a detailed study in 1994 examined the guns closely, it confirmed that the extraction failures of the American version traced to incorrect chamber measurements and substandard manufacturing, a specific, fixable, factory-level fault, and not to some fundamental stupidity in the basic design that the French had somehow failed to notice for years. The worst reputation attached itself to the worst-made version, and then spread backward, unfairly, over the entire family of guns, tarring the workable French weapon with the failures of the botched American one. There is a human fact that sits very awkwardly beside the label, and it deserves to be looked at squarely. 3 American soldiers were awarded the Medal of Honor, their nation's highest decoration for valor, for actions fought with a Chauchat in their hands in 1918. Private Nels Wold of the 35th Division, who was killed in his action and received the award posthumously. Private Frank Bart of the 2nd Division. Private Thomas Nybar of the 42nd Division. Whatever the gun's failings, and they were real, 3 men fought actions of the highest recognized courage with this weapon and prevailed, using it to do things that earned their country's greatest honor. A gun that was purely and universally useless in every hand and every instance does not appear in that company. The record and the reputation do not quite fit together, and where they do not fit, it is usually the reputation that has been oversimplified. This is the place for the central correction, and it is owed the channel's plainest restraint. The claim that the Chauchat is simply the worst gun ever made, an object incapable of finishing a magazine, is not supported by the full weight of the evidence. It is supported by the genuine experience of the .30-06 version in American hands, which was authentically terrible, and which those men remembered accurately. That real, specific, narrow experience was then generalized, in the retelling, into a sweeping verdict on everything the gun had ever been in, every country and every caliber. The myth felt true, and it felt true for an understandable reason. The men who wrote the English-language memory of the Chauchat were, overwhelmingly, the men who had been issued its worst incarnation, the American gunners whose weapons stuck and froze and failed them in the Argonne. Their frustration was real and earned, and deserves respect. It was also specific to their version of the gun, and the story that grew from it stripped away the very specifics that would have made it fair. None of this is a defense of the gun, and it should not be mistaken for one. The 8mm version overheated, kicked its gunners in the face, and jammed at its open magazine 2 times out of 3. The .30-06 version was, in the field, close to unusable when it mattered. The point is not that the Chauchat was secretly good, because it was not. The point is that a fair judge distinguishes between a mediocre, flawed, but usable gun and the single worst firearm ever built, and the honest evidence places the Chauchat in the first category, not the second. That fairness costs something. It costs the clean, satisfying story. It replaces a simple villain, a laughably terrible gun, with a more complicated and more human truth, a decent and even prophetic idea, built too cheaply and too fast, and then botched outright in translation to a foreign cartridge. The trade-off of the reputation itself is worth naming, because reputations have costs too. The simple legend is satisfying, memorable, and easy to repeat, and it travels well as a single line at a dinner table or in a video title. The accurate account is duller and more demanding. It requires holding 2 guns, 2 calibers, 2 armies, and 4 years in mind at once, and refusing the easy laugh. The legend won the popular memory because it was easier to carry. The record survives, quietly, for anyone willing to set the legend down and look at what is underneath it. And a gun made in the hundreds of thousands does not simply vanish because English-speaking soldiers were glad to be rid of it. While its reputation curdled in one language, the physical weapon went on serving for decades, in armies that measured it not against the excellent Browning, but against the far worse alternative of having nothing at all. Chapter 11. 8 armies and a long surplus life. The gun that American doughboys threw down the morning after the armistice was, for a long list of other armies, a weapon they could not possibly afford to throw away. The Chauchat's afterlife is the part of its story the legend leaves out entirely, and it is the part that most complicates the simple verdict. Made by the 250,000, the gun did not disappear in 1918. It scattered across Europe and beyond, changed hands and cartridges, and kept soldiering for decades, into a Second World War that the men who designed it had never imagined. The list of users reads like a survey of the interwar arms trade among the smaller and poorer powers, the nations that took what they could get. Belgium acquired on the order of 7,000 of them, and rechambered many to the 7.65mm Mauser cartridge that suited its own supply. Poland, rebuilding an army from nothing after regaining its independence, held 11,869 of them under the designation RKM-WZ-15, and later converted nearly 6,000 to fire 8mm Mauser, redesignating those as the WZ-1527. Yugoslavia assembled a force of them from more than one source, some 1,400 inherited from Serbia and around 4,000 purchased from Belgium, and rechambered them to 7.9mm. Italy held 1,729. Romania fielded 4,495. The Russian Empire had received about 6,100 during the war itself. Greece fielded thousands, including 3,950 that came to it by way of Poland. Each of these was an army for which a cheap, available, already made automatic weapon, whatever its documented faults, beat the only real alternative, which was to issue its infantry no automatic weapon at all. Set those figures side by side and a pattern emerges that the legend never mentions. Belgium's 7,000, Poland's nearly 12,000, Yugoslavia's several thousand, Romania's 4,500, Russia's 6,000, Greece's thousands, Italy's 1,700, Finland's 5,000, and Hungary's 50,000 add up to a great deal of continued service by a weapon supposedly fit only for the scrap heap. And notice how many of those armies took the trouble to rechamber their guns. To 7.65mm Mauser, to 8mm Mauser, to 7.9mm, to fit their own supply. Rechambering is real work and real expense. No one spends it on a weapon they intend to discard. The interwar world quietly voted on the Chauchat with its purchasing and its gunsmithing. And the vote was not that the gun was worthless. The vote was that it was cheap, it was available, and it was better than an empty hand, which for most of the world's armies through those decades was the honest measure of any weapon. The gun even changed hands as spoils of war and as barter, long after its French makers had moved on. When Germany overran countries that still used the Chauchat in the Second World War, it swept the captured guns into its own inventory under new German designations, marking the French guns as the light machine gun 156F and giving similar labels to the Belgian, Greek, and Yugoslav examples it took. A weapon rejected by its own creators was pressed back into service by its conquerors. And in one especially striking transaction, Hungary is recorded as receiving around 50,000 Chauchats in 1942, handed over in exchange for food during the desperate accounting of the Middle War years. A weapon written off in English as the worst gun ever built was, in the middle of the largest war in history, still worth trading by the tens of thousands for something to eat. That is not the market price of a useless object. One of those later chapters is worth standing inside, because it shows what the gun meant to men who had no better option. When Finland fought the Soviet Union in the Winter War of 1939 and 1940, hopelessly outnumbered and desperate for any weapon that could fire, it took whatever automatic arms the world was willing to send, and more than 5,000 Chauchats arrived as donations from abroad. Picture the Finnish soldier in the snow, in a war his country was expected to lose, handed a French gun 2 full decades past its prime, a gun whose reputation had already been blackened in English on the far side of the world. He did not have the luxury of that reputation, and it would have meant nothing to him if he had. He had a frozen position to hold, an enemy advancing across the ice in front of it, and an automatic weapon in his hands that was worth more than any story ever told about it. For that man, in that snow, the Chauchat was not a punchline. It was firepower he would not otherwise have had, and firepower was survival. This is the correction the afterlife quietly makes to the legend. The story of the Chauchat, as it is usually told, ends abruptly at the armistice, with the American gun discarded in disgust and the whole weapon consigned to history's junk pile. That is only the American ending, and America was only one chapter. The gun itself soldiered on through the entire interwar period and deep into the Second World War, in the hands of armies from Warsaw to Belgrade to Helsinki, precisely because it was cheap, and it was available. And above all, it was there when better weapons were not. The very qualities that made rich, well-supplied armies eager to be rid of it made poor, hard-pressed armies unable to let it go. The trade-off that had defined the gun from its birth held true all the way to its end, and closed the story with the same logic it had opened. Its cheapness made it disposable to the armies that could afford something better, the kind of weapon an American gunner was overjoyed to turn in for a Browning the day the guns fell silent. That identical cheapness made it indispensable to the armies that could not afford anything better, the kind of weapon a Finnish soldier in the snow was profoundly grateful to be handed at all. One gun, one price, one set of flaws, and 2 completely opposite verdicts, decided not by the weapon itself, but entirely by what the men holding it could otherwise obtain. The Chauchat was never simply good or bad. It was good or bad relative to the alternative, and for millions of soldiers across 30 years, the alternative was nothing. By the time the last Chauchats were finally retired from the world's backline and second-rate service, the thing they had been reaching for all along had long since arrived and matured into something excellent. The gun was gone, or going, worn out and obsolete. But the idea it had carried, badly and first, into the mud of 1915, had won completely and permanently, and every weapon that had replaced it was, in its own design, a quiet admission of exactly what the Chauchat had been right about from the beginning. Chapter 12. What the Chauchat proved. The Chauchat failed at nearly everything a weapon is conventionally judged on. It overheated, it kicked, it jammed, its magazine let in the mud, and in its worst version, it could barely fire at all. Yet it succeeded at the one thing that mattered more than all the rest combined, and its long list of failures should not be allowed to hide that single success. The Chauchat proved that the infantry squad needed an automatic weapon it could carry into the attack. And that proof outlived every one of the gun's flaws and every insult ever thrown at it. Look at what replaced it. Because the replacements are the argument, and they make the case better than any defense could. France retired the Chauchat and adopted the Fusil Mitrailleur Model 1924, soon refined into the well-regarded F-meters 2429, a gas-operated light machine gun firing a modern 7.5mm rimless cartridge, and built it in the hundreds of thousands, around 232,000 of them, a weapon that served France for decades. The United States fielded the Browning automatic rifle it had been waiting for all along, first used in combat by the 79th Division on the 22nd of September 1918 in the Meuse-Argonne, in the same battle where the borrowed Chauchats were failing. Both of those weapons filled precisely the role the Chauchat had been built to fill, the squad's own portable automatic. Both did it far better. And both existed because a need had been identified and proven, a need the Chauchat had been the first weapon in the world to try, however clumsily, to meet. Notice, carefully, what the successors fixed, because the list of their improvements is a list of the Chauchat's specific sins. They used rimless cartridges, which fed cleanly and did not force a deep, awkward, half-moon magazine onto the gun. They used enclosed magazines that sealed the ammunition safely away from the mud and grit of the battlefield, curing the exact fault that General Pétain's survey had identified back in 1916 as the cause of 2/3 of the Chauchat's stoppages. They used more robust gas-operated actions that ran cooler and did not depend on a long barrel sliding freely inside a sleeve that heat could bind. They were made to tighter tolerances by makers who held them. Point by point, item by item, the guns that replaced the Chauchat corrected the specific things the Chauchat had gotten wrong. That is not a coincidence, and it is not an accident of progress. It is what happens when an army learns hard lessons from a weapon, even a bad weapon, and especially a bad weapon, because a bad weapon teaches more sharply than a good one. Stand one last time with the gunner, the role rather than any single man, because it is the role that persisted while the gun passed away. He was the soldier who carried the squad's automatic firepower forward in the assault, who put suppressing fire onto the enemy position while his comrades rose and closed the distance. In 1916, that man was handed a Chauchat and told to make it work, and he mostly did, and he cursed it with every jam and every slap of its recoil. A few years later, the very same role, in the very same kind of squad, was handed a weapon that actually worked as intended, that fired when he pulled the trigger, and kept firing. The job had not changed at all. The doctrine of walking fire, of the squad carrying its own automatic weapon into the advance, was fully validated and permanently established, even as the specific, flawed gun that had first carried that doctrine into battle was thrown onto the scrap heap and laughed at. The last myth to correct is the largest one of all, and it contains all the others. It is the idea that the Chauchat's story is only, simply, a story of failure, a comedy of a terrible gun. It is not that, or not only that. It is the story of a correct and even prophetic idea, reached for too early, with manufacturing tools too crude to realize it cleanly, and in a hurry too great to get it right. The requirement it answered was real and permanent, and every army in the world eventually built a weapon to answer that same requirement. The Chauchat was wrong in 100 small and painful details of execution. The Chauchat was right about the one large thing that mattered most, and its very wrongness in the details is exactly what taught the next generation of guns how to be right. That is the final trade-off of the whole story, and it is the heaviest one, the one the Chauchat paid on behalf of everything that came after it. It paid the full price of being first. It absorbed the overheating and the jamming and the ruined reputation, all of it, borne by the gun itself and by the men who carried it through 2 world wars. The weapons that followed, the F-meters 2429 and the Browning and all their descendants, collected the reward, the reliability and the respect and the honored place in history, and they built that reward on lessons the Chauchat had already paid for in full and in advance. Being first cost the Chauchat everything, including its good name. Being first is also the entire reason it mattered, and matters still. The gun was wrong. The idea behind it was right. That single sentence is the whole of the Chauchat, and it is the reason a weapon remembered in one language as the worst ever built sits, in fact, at the very beginning of a long line of weapons that no modern army could imagine doing without. An army needed to fire while it moved forward, and it had nothing that could do it. That was the problem the Chauchat was born to solve, and it is where its story ends as surely as it is where the story begins. From that single, urgent need came a doctrine of walking fire, and 4 names on a receiver, and a bicycle factory turned overnight into an armory. From that factory came 250,000 guns, cheap and light and stamped from thin steel, each one carrying the same open half-moon magazine that would cause 2/3 of its failures. From French service came a hard and fair verdict, A gun that mostly worked in short, disciplined bursts and was hated for the days and the moments when it did not. From American haste came the wrong cartridge, and the wrong chamber, and the extraction failure that finally gave the weapon its cruel name in history. And from the surplus yards and the arms markets came a long second life, in Poland and Belgium and Finland and Hungary and half a dozen armies more, in the hands of soldiers far too hard-pressed to care in the slightest what English speakers had decided to call their gun. The central question was how you arm an entire army in a hurry, and what becomes of the corners you cut to do it. The Chauchat is the complete, 4-year, 2-war answer. You can arm an army fast, faster than any careful arsenal could ever manage, and for a time, in the emergency, the speed is genuinely worth what it costs. But the corners you cut do not disappear when the guns leave the line and reach the front. They wait. They wait for heat, and for mud, and for a magazine cut open to the weather, and for a chamber reamed wrong in a cartridge the gun was never designed around. And then, on a battlefield, in a frightened soldier's hands, at the worst possible moment, they come due all at once. The bill for building fast is always paid later, and it is always, without exception, paid by the man holding the gun. The Chauchat proved that the squad automatic weapon was the future of infantry war, and it proved it in the hardest possible way, by failing at almost every part of being one. It showed an entire generation of designers exactly what such a weapon had to be, by being, in detail after detail, the thing it could not quite manage to become. Its many successors are its true monument, and its terrible reputation is its lasting wound. And the honest truth is that it earned them both. France built it to be cheap enough to lose. History made certain it would be remembered as the worst thing America ever carried.